So we've just heard the reading in John chapter 10, in which Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd." Listeners at the time would have instantly understood this and known what it meant, because shepherding was very much a part of their everyday life. They knew the role and responsibility of a shepherd well and would have understood the difference in the characteristics of a good and a bad shepherd. Probably most of our knowledge of shepherds actually does come from the Bible. They pop up regularly. Shepherds were the first people to hear the news of Jesus' birth. There are many other references to shepherds in the Bible, and Abraham, Moses, and David were also shepherds. We've probably developed a bit of a romanticised version of some men out on a wild hill, peaceful but gathered round a warm fire, surrounded by some gentle sheep. This is certainly the image in thousands of nativity plays when children put on their striped dressing gowns and put a tea towel on their head and bring a toy sheep to leave at the manger. Although if you go to hilly parts of the UK, you will see thousands of sheep gently grazing, you won't necessarily see any shepherds constantly standing guard over them. Don't think you see sheep so much in Belgium. I'm not sure it's hilly enough for them. The actual job of being a shepherd in Jesus' time was, and indeed still is in many parts of the world, much more challenging and dangerous. When thinking of the role of the shepherd, we can see and know in it many of the metaphors that people in Jesus' time would have understood. There are many examples of shepherds in the Bible because shepherding was such a vital occupation. Often we think of shepherds only tending sheep, but shepherds also looked after goats. Sheep and goats were essential for milk and meat, and sheep were essential for their fleeces and skins, which could be traded and made into clothing and vessels for liquids, and they were also used in sacrifices. Everyone needed sheep for some aspect of their lives. Shepherds were responsible for leading the flock to graze during the day on fresh pastures, watching out for any poisonous plants, keeping the flock together, and leading them on when the food supplies dwindled. They would lead them to known water sources to allow them to drink. At night, the shepherd would guide the sheep to the sheepfolds, possibly some handy caves, and would check the health of the sheep and count the size of the flock. The sheep all knew the voice of the shepherd and would follow him, knowing that he would care for them and trusting him to make the right decisions. Farming in all times and places is a seasonal business. In spring, it's lambing season, and this increases the size of the flock with vulnerable lambs. In summer, as the temperatures rise, the flock are herded to higher pastures where it's cooler and more comfortable for the woolly creatures. In autumn, as the temperatures dip, the sheep are brought back to lower ground for safety from exposure to bad weather and increasingly desperate predators. In Jesus' time, to protect the sheep, a shepherd would carry a sling and use it to throw stones at predators such as wolves, bears, lions, foxes, and jackals, as well as eagles. The sling could also be used to throw stones just beyond a wandering sheep to encourage it to return back to the rest of the flock, showing it gently where the boundaries of the flock were. A shepherd, therefore, had to be hard-working, dependable, and brave. They were living out in isolated areas with only their sheep for company. The sheep were vulnerable and totally reliant on the shepherd. A shepherd's role was to look after each sheep and ensure it was the best version of a sheep it could be, to ensure that when the shepherd needed to, he could sell it to provide for his family. Shepherding was also probably work that made people dirty, dusty, hot, and sweaty. Sheep's wool's pretty greasy, it gets matted, there are insects, twigs, and leaves in it, and living out in all weathers would mean that wealthier people would probably have looked down on shepherds for their slightly rougher lifestyle. Once again, we see Jesus associating himself with the people deemed as outside a more acceptable society. The Bible and Jesus' parables have many positive metaphors of shepherds. So when Jack gave me the I Am saying for today's sermon, he laughed and said, "You probably don't know any actual shepherds." Not totally true, Jack. My granddad was a farmer and spent his life caring for herds, not of sheep, but of cows. And growing up, I enjoyed hearing stories that my mum told me about Grandad wading into ponds to rescue cows that had got themselves stuck or retrieving those that had been a bit too adventurous and wandered off. The love and care that he showed his cows was very clear. While this was all in the safety of Cheshire, rather than 2,000 years ago in the Holy Land, trust me, there were no bears, wolves or lions wild in Cheshire. But there were many similarities between a 20th century farmer and a shepherd in Jesus' time. The animals in care of farmers and shepherds are reliant on the care, wisdom, experience, decision-making, and the tending that they receive from the farmers and shepherds. And in their turn, the farmers and shepherds love and rely on their animals. They know them as individuals and want them to be the best version of themselves, whether that be a sheep, a cow, a chicken, or a duck. I was lucky enough during my I'd like to be a vet phase to do some work experience at a zoo. I was really moved to discover how much the keepers loved their animals. They knew their personalities, they knew their characteristics, and could absolutely tell when the animals were happy, unwell, frightened, or just needed a little bit of a calm, quiet voice to help them to recover. They responded well and always with trust. When Jesus says, "I am the Good Shepherd," he's telling us that he cares deeply for each of us as an individual. He knows our personality, our characteristics, our strengths, our thoughts, and our flaws. He is promising to make sacrifices for us, laying down his life for us and being there for us always. These are all the characteristics that Jesus' listeners would have recognized in a shepherd. This is echoed in Psalm 23, which we have just sung. The Lord as our shepherd provides us with all that we need, leads us through our lives in good times and bad, keeps us safe from harm, and sees us through each stage of our life. As part of Jesus' flock, we need to recognize his voice in the same way the sheep recognizes the voice of the shepherd. We need to follow his voice and his example, trusting that he will lead, nurture, protect, and defend us. We actually spend very little of our time in our lives in total silence, away from the built-up areas that we all live in. And probably we can't imagine properly what life was like for those shepherds out on a hillside. The stillness and quietness, broken only by the occasional bleating of the sheep. The closest we can probably imagine is people who are leaders, doctors, nurses, parents, teachers, and clergy. Each of them is aiming for the people in their care to flourish and be the best version of themselves possible. Their role is to listen, observe, guide, offer advice, be alert for signs of concern, danger, or other problems, and to support and comfort where possible. In that regard, we also now know what it's like to be the sheep. We've all needed people in our lives to guide and shape us to become the people we are today and the people we will become in the future. Perhaps we all need to spend a bit of time in quiet and peace to allow ourselves to listen to God's guiding voice. We know it's there, but sometimes in our busy hustle and bustle lives, it gets a bit lost. God knows our voice, and we have to make time to know his too, to listen to what he is saying and to respond. Out in the space and relative peace of the countryside, possibly surrounded by sheep, we can see and hear God's love for us. It's for us to trust our good shepherd, like the sheep, in what he is saying, and allow us to be guided to be our best version. Now, I've discussed with some of you before how much I like a certain poem called The Other by the Welsh poet R.S. Thomas, and I discovered this poem while at university in Wales, a very beautiful country, well known, as well as for its brilliant rugby team, for its sheep farming. And for me, this poem, while not specifically mentioning shepherds, reminds me of the constancy of the shepherd on the hillside, listening out for the moment that the sheep is in need. The shepherd is listening out for danger. He's caring for his flock at all times and forever. And it also encapsulates some of the remoteness that I imagine might have been felt by a shepherd in Jesus' time at night in the pitch darkness on the hills. I'd like to read it for you now. There are nights that are so still that I can hear the small owl calling far off and a fox barking miles away. It is then that I lie in the lean hours, awake, listening to the swell born somewhere in the Atlantic, rising and falling, wave on the long shore by the village that is without light and companionless. And the thought comes of that other being who is awake too, letting our prayers break on him, not like this for a few hours, but for days, years, for eternity. I've always found the constancy and the eternal listening of God, the other, a beautiful description of God. Jesus the shepherd, therefore, is always there, always listening, and always alert, ready for the moment when we are ready to speak to him. Our role is always to trust in him, to be open, to hear his voice and to respond, knowing that he has our best interest at heart and that by listening and responding, our lives, like those of the sheep in the care of the shepherd, will be enriched and we can be assured of his promise of his love.